29. I asked for pain relief. Once, the Amish women stopped calling me brave. The morning my third child was born, Miriam Hochstetler held my hand through 7 hours of labor and never once let go. When it was over, when the room had quieted and the baby was wrapped and sleeping, she leaned close to my ear and said 2 words I had been hearing since I was a girl. So brave. I believed her every single time she said it. I believed all of them. I was 26 years old, and I did not yet understand that bravery, in the community where I grew up, was not a compliment. It was an instruction. My name is Sarah. I am 51 years old now, and I have been trying to find the right words for this story for most of my adult life. Not because the events are difficult to remember. They are the clearest memories I own. But because telling it means admitting something I spent a long time refusing to admit. That the women I loved most were not simply praising me. They were teaching me what I was allowed to want. I want to start with my mother, because she is where it began. Her name was Ruth, and she was the most capable woman I have ever known. She could preserve 40 jars of tomatoes in an afternoon, sew a wedding dress in 3 evenings, and carry a fever through an entire harvest week, without a single person knowing she was ill. That last part she mentioned once, almost proudly, when I was perhaps 9 years old. I remember standing beside her at the kitchen basin, watching her scrub a pot, and asking why she hadn't told anyone she was sick. She looked at me in the way she sometimes did, not unkind, but certain. Because there was work to do, she said. And because a woman who complains becomes a burden. And a burden, she paused and handed me the pot to dry, is not what we are here to be. I did not question that. In the community where I grew up in Lancaster County, silence about physical suffering was not merely a preference. It was woven into the fabric of what it meant to be a faithful woman. Our bishop preached often about the body being temporary and the soul being eternal. And somewhere between those two ideas, it became understood that tending too carefully to one's own pain was a kind of vanity. You bore what God gave you. You trusted that bearing it made you stronger. And the women around you confirmed this by watching and nodding and calling you brave. My mother was called brave all her life. I grew up wanting nothing more than to deserve that same word. I was 19 when I married Daniel Yoder. He was a quiet man, thoughtful in the way that can look like gentleness from the outside. His mother, Edna, was a different matter entirely. Edna was the kind of woman who entered a room and immediately understood its hierarchy. She had raised 4 sons and buried 1 husband, and had opinions about everything from bread-rising times to the proper way a daughter-in-law should address her elders. She was not cruel in any obvious way. She was precise. And from the first week of my marriage, she was watching me with the particular attention of someone who is deciding whether you are strong enough to be trusted. The first test came quietly. 3 months into the marriage, I developed a deep ache in my lower back that I eventually understood had to do with the way our mattress sat on the frame. It was a simple problem with a simple solution. But when I mentioned it at Sunday dinner, not even as a complaint, simply as a practical matter, the table went briefly quiet. Edna set down her fork. My mother-in-law had a way of saying nothing that said everything. Later that evening, Daniel's oldest sister, Ruth, there were 2 Ruths in my life, which I always found quietly significant, pulled me aside in the kitchen. Edna noticed you brought up your back, she said, her voice low and even. It was only a practical concern, I said. Ruth dried her hands on her apron and looked at me with something that was almost pity. I know, she said, but in this family, we don't bring our bodies to the table. Then she smiled, and it was a kind smile, and she squeezed my arm. You'll learn. I told myself she was helping me. For a long time, I believed she was. My first child, a boy we named Eli, was born 14 months after the wedding. The labor was hard and long, and I was attended by Edna, my own mother, and Miriam Hochstetler, who served as the community's primary birth attendant. At some point in the small hours of the morning, when the pain had moved beyond anything I had experienced, I asked, quietly, carefully, in the way I had learned to ask for things, whether there was something that could be given to help. The room shifted. Not dramatically. There were no sharp words, no visible anger. My mother glanced at Miriam. Miriam glanced at Edna. Edna said nothing, but she folded her hands in a way I had come to recognize as a closing of a subject. "You're doing beautifully," Miriam said. She reached for my hand. "These last hours are the hardest. But you are strong, Sarah." I did not ask again. Eli was born just before dawn, and when it was over and I was lying there with him on my chest, Miriam touched my hair and said, "So brave." My mother said it too. Even Edna, standing at the foot of the bed, gave me a single slow nod that I understood, in that community, was high praise. I held the word like a lamp in a dark room. I had earned it. I had passed the test I hadn't known I was taking. Over the next 4 years, I had 2 more children, a girl, Hannah, and then another boy, Joseph. Each birth followed a similar pattern. Each time, around the deepest point, I would feel the impulse to ask rising in me like a tide, and each time I pressed it back down because I already understood what asking would cost. The room would shift, the glances would pass between the women, and I would not be called brave at the end, or the call would be quieter, smaller, as though the asking itself had diminished what I had survived. It sounds almost manageable when I describe it that way, like a social rule, the kind any community has, peculiar perhaps, but not harmful. I told myself that for years. It was only a custom. It was only expectation. These were women who loved me. But during the year after Joseph was born, something changed that made me look at it differently. Her name was Clara Lapp. She was 23, newly married, and she had come to our community from a district in Ohio. She did not yet know all the rules. In her first winter with us, she developed an infection following a minor injury, and she asked the bishop's wife directly whether the community's healing fund could help her see a doctor for antibiotics. She was helped. The infection was treated. She recovered fully. But I noticed, in the weeks that followed, that the women spoke about Clara differently. Not harshly. Nothing as obvious as gossip. It was more like a slight cooling, a slight distance. She was not called weak openly, because we did not do things openly. She was simply included a degree less warmly, invited a fraction less readily. And when she had her first child the following autumn, the birth was attended, and she was helped. But at the end, no one leaned over and said, "So brave." I watched all of this, and understood it in a way I had never been able to name before. The word was not freely given. It was conditional. It was payment for a specific silence. And for the first time, I felt something cold settle in my chest when I thought about how many times I had been paid with it. It was Miriam I trusted most, outside of my own mother. Miriam had delivered hundreds of children in our community. She had sat with the dying. She had held women through losses no one discussed in public. I had known her since I was a child, and I had always understood her to be the most honest woman in our circle. Not blunt, not harsh, but honest in the way that comes from having witnessed too much suffering to pretend it away entirely. In the spring when Joseph was 2 years old, I developed what I eventually understood was a significant problem with one of my teeth. The pain was not incidental. It was constant and severe, spreading through my jaw, disrupting my sleep for weeks. I told Daniel. He was not indifferent. He was genuinely concerned. But when I mentioned seeing a dentist, he said he would speak to the bishop about the appropriateness and the cost. And then several weeks passed without the conversation being completed. I went to Miriam. I told her the truth. I told her how long it had been hurting, and how bad it had become. I told her I had not wanted to raise it at Sunday meals, or in front of Edna, and that I was telling her now, because I trusted her, and because I needed someone to understand that this was beyond what I could simply continue to endure quietly. She listened to all of it. She made me tea. She sat across from me at her kitchen table, and was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Have you tried the clove oil I gave you last month?" I told her I had. I told her it had helped briefly, and then stopped helping. She nodded. Then she said, "I'll speak to Daniel. There may be a way to arrange a visit. But Sarah," she paused, "you know how these things look. If we go to the elders asking, it draws attention. It makes you seem—" She stopped herself, but I heard the word she hadn't said. I heard it as clearly as if she'd spoken it aloud. It makes you seem like someone who cannot endure. I drove home from Miriam's that afternoon, feeling something I had never felt in her company before. I felt alone. The dentist visit was eventually arranged, quietly, with Daniel accompanying me, and the matter handled as though it were a practical errand, rather than a medical need. The tooth was saved. The pain ended. And no one called me brave for it, because that kind of pain, the kind that required outside help, was not the kind that earned the word. I returned to the community's rhythm. I baked, I sewed, I raised my children, I attended church. I learned to carry small sufferings without mentioning them, and larger ones by calibrating carefully how I presented them. Always practical, never emotional, never in a way that suggested the body had overwhelmed the spirit. But something had shifted in me since the conversation with Miriam. A small, quiet awareness that I kept returning to in the evenings after the children were asleep. I began, for the first time, to look at the women around me not as a circle of people who loved and supported one another, but as a collection of individuals each managing her own version of the same silence. My mother, who had carried a fever through harvest week and considered it a virtue. Ruth, Daniel's sister, who had pulled me aside in the kitchen and told me to learn. Who, I knew by then, had lost partial hearing in one ear following an untreated infection the year before her own marriage. Edna, whose hands trembled in the cold in a way that had worsened each winter, and who would not acknowledge it even when I offered to carry things she had set down. Miriam, who had delivered hundreds of children, and whose own knees, I knew, caused her significant pain, and who still refused to sit during a delivery because sitting, she had once said, looked as though one was not fully present. We were all doing the same thing. We were all holding the same silence. And we were handing it to each other across tables and bedsides and kitchen counters, and calling it strength. The moment the title of this story belongs to arrived in my 38th year. My fourth child, a girl we named Rebecca, came early and came hard. There were complications I will not describe in full, because some of what happened belongs only to that room and to me. What I will say is that by the midpoint of that labor, I was not simply in pain. I was frightened in a way that I had not been frightened before, and the fear had its own quality. It was the fear of someone who understands that the body can reach a limit that willpower cannot cross. Miriam was there. My mother was there. Ruth was there. Edna had died the previous winter, and her absence was its own particular presence in that room. At the moment I understood I could not continue without help, not a softer kind of help, not clove oil or a hand to hold or a woman telling me I was strong. I said it, clearly, without softening it, without framing it practically, without managing how it would sound. I need something for the pain, I said. Please, I need real help. The room did not erupt. It never did. In that community. There were no raised voices, no visible judgment. What happened was quieter, and, I have come to understand, more consequential. Miriam's eyes moved to my mother. My mother's hands stilled on the quilt she had been holding. Ruth looked at the window. Miriam said, "We'll see what we can do." And the phrase was so familiar, so carefully nothing, that I understood she was not going to do anything. I bore the rest of that labor without additional help. Rebecca was born safely, and she was healthy, and she was beautiful. And when it was over, when the room had settled, Miriam came to sit beside me. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she said, "You did well," and stood and crossed the room to rinse her hands. She did not say brave. My mother did not say it. Ruth did not say it. Not that evening, not in the days that followed, not in the months after when we gathered for Sunday meals and quilting circles, and the ordinary rhythm of community life. I had asked, and in asking, I had stepped outside the agreement that none of us had ever signed, and all of us had been keeping. I had named the pain out loud, and requested that it be addressed, and in doing so I had revealed that I understood the word's true function. A woman who knows she's being managed cannot be called brave for being managed. The word only works if the woman believes it. I did not leave the community over this. I want to be clear about that. Because I know the shape people expect this kind of story to take. I stayed. I raised my 4 children inside those same fences, attended the same church, sat at the same tables. I loved those women, even after I understood what the word had been doing. Love and understanding are not the same as agreement, and I learned to hold both. What changed was smaller and more permanent than leaving. I stopped performing. Not loudly, not defiantly. I simply stopped managing how my pain appeared to other people. When something hurt, I said so. Not every time, not theatrically, but without the careful calibration I had spent 2 decades practicing. I learned to speak to a doctor without routing the request through 3 other people first. I taught my daughters that their bodies were not arguments to be won, that needing help was not evidence of spiritual weakness, that a woman who cannot endure everything silently is not failing at womanhood. Miriam and I remained close, in a complicated way, until her death 9 years ago. I think about her often. I think about the truth that she was as trapped as any of us, perhaps more so, because she had spent her life enforcing the system while also being subject to it. I watched her manage her knees until the end. I watched her refuse a cane for 2 years past when she needed one, because the cane would have meant admitting to a weakness, and Miriam's whole identity was built on being the woman who did not have weaknesses. At her funeral, the women said she was brave. I sat in that church and understood, for the first time fully, that the word had always been a ceiling. That calling us brave was the community's way of marking the height above which we were not allowed to reach, and we had believed it was the sky. My daughter Rebecca is 30 now. She is not Amish. She left at 17, a decision that involved its own kind of grief and complexity, and that I will not diminish by summarizing here. What I will say is that on the day she left, she came to me first. She sat across from me at my kitchen table, the same kind of table I had sat at in Miriam's kitchen all those years ago, and she said she needed me to understand that she was not leaving because she was weak. I told her I knew that. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "You always told us we were allowed to hurt. You always said that." Her voice was not accusing. She was giving me something. I thought about my mother carrying a fever through harvest week. I thought about Miriam's hands, rough and certain, holding mine through 7 hours of labor. I thought about the word that had been given and withheld like currency. I thought about a room going quiet when I asked for something I needed. "Yes," I told Rebecca. "You are." She nodded. Then she picked up her bag and walked out the door, and I sat at that table for a long time without moving. I did not cry. My hands were steady, and there was no one there to call me brave for it, which was, I believe, exactly as it should have been.